The officers in the wardroom of the Kriegsmarine base at Kiel were laughing so hard that cognac nearly spilled from their crystal tumblers, passing around a grainy intelligence photograph that showed what appeared to be a child's bathtub toy floating in a Scottish loch, a ridiculous contraption barely 50 feet long that the British were apparently calling a submarine, and Kapitan Zur, C. Friedrich Hoffmann, a decorated U-boat commander with 17 Allied ships to his name, held the photograph up to the light streaming through the tall windows and declared in his thick Prussian accent that the English must be truly desperate if they were sending their sailors to war in sardine cans, which prompted another round of derisive laughter from the assembled officers who had spent years perfecting the art of underwater warfare in their massive Type 9 U-boats. Vessels that displaced over 1,000 tons and could cruise for months across entire oceans, while this British contraption looked like it might sink if someone sneezed too hard near it. What these men didn't know, couldn't possibly have imagined as they mocked and drank and celebrated their supposed superiority, was that within 2 years, these toy submarines would accomplish what the entire Royal Air Force had failed to do, with hundreds of bombing raids and thousands of tons of ordnance. They would sink the Tirpitz, the most powerful battleship in the German fleet, a 42,900-ton Leviathan that had terrorized the North Atlantic and tied up enormous Allied naval resources simply by existing. A ship so formidable that Winston Churchill himself had declared its destruction a top priority, offering medals, promotions, and eternal glory to anyone who could send it to the bottom. And it would be these laughable toys, these midget submarines, that the Kriegsmarine dismissed as suicidal folly, that would deliver the killing blow and prove that in war, as in life, it's not the size of the vessel, but the courage of the men inside it that determines victory or defeat. The story begins not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, oil-stained workshops of Portsmouth, where in late 1942, a small team of naval engineers and designers were working on what the official documents delicately termed Special Operations Craft, which was bureaucratic language for a vessel so dangerous, so likely to kill its own crew, that the Admiralty could barely bring itself to acknowledge its existence. Yet desperation breeds innovation, and Britain was desperate. Having watched helplessly as the Tirpitz lurked in Norwegian fjords like a caged monster, forcing the Royal Navy to maintain enormous battle groups just to counter the threat of its emergence, diverting ships and resources that were desperately needed elsewhere, while convoys to Russia ran a gauntlet of U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, losing precious cargo and thousands of lives in the frigid Arctic waters. Commander Thomas Godwin, a veteran submariner with a reputation for unconventional thinking and a face that looked like it had been carved from Scottish granite, stood in the drafty warehouse watching welders shower sparks across the hull of X-5, one of 6 midget submarines under construction. Vessels that measured just 51 feet long and displaced a mere 30 tons, powered by a single diesel engine that generated barely 42 horsepower, armed not with torpedoes, but with 2 massive side charges packed with 2 tons of Amatex high explosive each, charges that would be placed directly beneath the target ship's hull before the X-craft made its escape. Assuming, of course, that everything went perfectly, which in Godwin's extensive experience it almost never did, especially when you were piloting a submarine with a maximum diving depth of 300 feet, no real defensive weapons, and a crew compartment so cramped that 4 men lived in a space smaller than most people's bathrooms, breathing recycled air that tasted like metal and sweat, navigating by periscope and prayer through enemy-controlled waters where a single depth charge could crush their hull like a beer can. The volunteers who stepped forward to crew these vessels were a special breed, men who looked at the X-craft specifications, the claustrophobic interior, the primitive controls, the high probability of death by drowning, suffocation, or explosive decompression, and still raised their hands, young lieutenants and sub-lieutenants with names like Basil Place, Donald Cameron, Godfrey Place, and Henry Henty Creer. Men who came from good families and had promising futures ahead of them, but chose instead to climb into what their fellow submariners called tin coffins and sail them into the heart of Nazi-occupied Norway. Because someone had to do it? Because the Tirpitz had to die? Because Britain was fighting for its survival, and conventional weapons had failed again and again, with RAF bombers losing aircraft by the dozen without landing a single significant hit on the battleship that sat in Kofjord, protected by anti-aircraft batteries, torpedo nets, smoke generators, and the sheer impossibility of navigating the narrow, heavily defended fjords that surrounded it. Training began in the cold waters of Scotland, in Loch Cairnbawn and Loch Striven, where the X-craft crews learned to navigate underwater mazes, practiced attaching and releasing their explosive charges, and discovered just how many things could go wrong in a vessel that had been designed with barely enough redundancy to qualify as safe. Experiencing equipment failures that ranged from the merely terrifying to the genuinely life-threatening, like the time X-8's periscope flooded during a training dive and the crew had to surface blind, or when X-9 got tangled in its own towing cable and nearly dragged its parent submarine down with it, or the countless instances of diesel fumes leaking into the crew compartment, causing men to pass out at their stations or hallucinate that they were back home having tea with their mothers, while actually piloting a submarine through waters that could kill them in seconds if they made a single mistake. The operational plan, designated Operation Source, called for 6 X-craft to be towed across the North Sea by conventional submarines, a journey of over 1,000 miles that would take nearly a week, with the midget submarine submerged during daylight hours and surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and ventilate, their crews swapping out with passage crews who would handle the long transit, while the operational crews rested aboard the parent submarines, conserving their strength for the actual attack, which would require every ounce of skill, endurance, and luck they possessed, because even if they survived the journey, even if they avoided detection by German patrol aircraft and surface vessels, even if they successfully navigated the minefields and torpedo nets that protected Kofjord, they would still have to maneuver their X-craft directly beneath a battleship that displaced 43,000 tons, place their charges with precision, set the timers, and then escape through the same gauntlet they'd just penetrated, all while knowing that the massive explosions would trigger a response so fierce that their chances of survival dropped to almost nothing, yet not one man asked to be relieved, not one crew requested transfer, because they understood what was at stake. Understood that the Tirpitz wasn't just a ship but a symbol of German naval power, and its destruction would be a blow to Nazi morale that no amount of propaganda could repair. On the 11th of September, 1943, the fleet sailed from Loch Cairnbawn, 6 parent submarines, each towing an X-craft, slipping out into the North Atlantic under cover of darkness, while back in Portsmouth, Admiral Barry and his staff gathered around maps and charts, marking the expected progress, knowing that once the submarines submerged, they would maintain radio silence until the operation concluded, meaning that for the next 10 days they would have no idea whether the attack force was even still alive, whether the tow cables had held, whether the X-craft had survived the violent storms that frequently swept across the North Sea, whether German intelligence had somehow discovered the plan and laid a trap. So all they could do was wait and hope and imagine the scene playing out in those cold northern waters where their men were sailing toward what most observers considered a suicide mission. The journey across the North Sea tested the X-craft beyond anything their designers had anticipated, with X-8 developing persistent mechanical problems that forced her to surface repeatedly, each emergence risking detection by German patrol aircraft, while X-9 suffered a catastrophic failure when her tow cable parted during rough seas and she sank with all hands, disappearing into the black depths with her crew entombed inside. Their names, Sub-Lieutenant Edmund Kieran, Sub-Lieutenant Victor Bomroy, Engine Room Artificer Albert Harda, and leading seaman Ernest Pomeroy, joining the long roll of submariners who had slipped beneath the waves and never returned. A grim reminder to the surviving crews that they were riding a razor's edge between mission success and oblivion. By September 20, the surviving X-craft and their parent submarines had reached the Norwegian coast, and now came the most dangerous part of the entire operation. The moment when the operational crews would transfer from the parent submarines back into their X-craft, taking over vessels that had been battered by a week of submersion and rough handling, checking and rechecking every system, every valve, every pressure gauge, while above them German patrol boats crisscrossed the dark waters and searchlights from shore installations swept across the waves. Because the Germans weren't fools, they knew the Allies wanted the Tirpitz dead, had expected attacks before and beaten them back, had created defensive networks so comprehensive that they believed their prize battleship was effectively invulnerable, protected by layers of steel nets, acoustic mines, hydrophone stations, and over 100 anti-aircraft guns that could depress their barrels to fire at surface targets, turning the fjord into a kill zone that any attacking force would have to traverse twice, once going in and once coming out, assuming they survived the initial penetration. Lieutenant Godfrey Place, commander of X-7, was a thin, intense man with the kind of calm demeanor that other sailors found either reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on whether they were serving with him or watching him make decisions that seemed to court disaster with methodical precision. And as he climbed through the hatch of his X-craft on that cold September morning, leaving behind the relative comfort and safety of HMS Stubborn, he knew that he was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return, that the next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the course of the entire naval war in Northern Europe, because if they succeeded, if they managed to cripple or sink the Tirpitz, the Royal Navy could redeploy dozens of capital ships to other theaters, the Arctic convoys would face reduced threats, and the psychological impact on both Allied and German forces would be incalculable. But if they failed, if they died without achieving their objective, then other men would have to try again and again until either the Tirpitz was destroyed or Britain ran out of volunteers willing to climb into midget submarines and sail them into hell. The approach to Kofjord required navigating a series of increasingly narrow passages, each one more heavily defended than the last. Starting with the broad waters of Stjernøfjord, where German patrol boats maintained regular schedules that the X-craft had to avoid, then into Altafjord, where hydrophone stations listened for the distinctive sounds of submarine propellers, and finally into Kofjord itself, where the Tirpitz lay at anchor, surrounded by 3 layers of anti-submarine nets that extended from the surface down to the rocky bottom, nets that were opened only to allow authorized vessels to pass through, meaning that the X-craft would have to find gaps, squeeze through tiers in the steel mesh, or simply force their way past, scraping along the bottom where the nets didn't quite reach, stirring up silt and praying that their hull didn't snag on the heavy cables that could hold them underwater until their air ran out and their crews suffocated in the darkness. X-7 went in first, with Place at the periscope calling out observations to his crew, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken on the controls, engine room artificer William Whitley on the diesels, and diver Bob Whittam, ready to exit the submarine if they needed to manually cut through nets, the 4 men working in practiced silence as their submarine crept forward at barely 2 knots, slow enough that Place could maintain depth control, but fast enough that they could maintain steerage, threading through the outer defenses as German sailors aboard the Tirpitz went about their morning routines, completely unaware that death was approaching from below, carried in a vessel so small that even if they'd spotted it on their hydrophones, they might have dismissed it as a large fish or equipment malfunction. The first net stopped them completely, the heavy steel mesh catching on X-7's bow and holding fast, forcing Place to reverse engines and try a different angle, then another. While precious minutes ticked away and the crew breathed increasingly stale air, the carbon dioxide scrubbers working overtime to keep the atmosphere barely breathable, until finally Whitley suggested they try diving deeper and scraping beneath the net, a dangerous maneuver that brought them within feet of the rocky bottom, where one wrong move could puncture their hull or foul their propeller, them back. Had created defensive networks so comprehensive that they believed their prize battleship was effectively invulnerable, protected by layers of steel nets, acoustic mines, hydrophone stations, and over 100 anti-aircraft guns that could depress their barrels to fire at surface targets, turning the fjord into a kill zone that any attacking force would have to traverse twice, once going in and once coming out, assuming they survived the initial penetration. Lieutenant Godfrey Place, commander of X-7, was a thin, intense man with the kind of calm demeanor that other sailors found either reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on whether they were serving with him or watching him make decisions that seemed to court disaster with methodical precision. And as he climbed through the hatch of his X-craft on that cold September morning, leaving behind the relative comfort and safety of HMS Stubborn, he knew that he was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return, that the next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the course of the entire naval war in Northern Europe, because if they succeeded, if they managed to cripple or sink the Tirpitz, the Royal Navy could redeploy dozens of capital ships to other theaters, the Arctic convoys would face reduced threats, and the psychological impact on both Allied and German forces would be incalculable. But if they failed, if they died without achieving their objective, then other men would have to try again and again until either the Tirpitz was destroyed or Britain ran out of volunteers willing to climb into midget submarines and sail them into hell. The approach to Kofjord required navigating a series of increasingly narrow passages, each one more heavily defended than the last. Starting with the broad waters of Stjernøfjord, where German patrol boats maintained regular schedules that the X-craft had to avoid, then into Altafjord, where hydrophone stations listened for the distinctive sounds of submarine propellers, and finally into Kofjord itself, where the Tirpitz lay at anchor, surrounded by 3 layers of anti-submarine nets that extended from the surface down to the rocky bottom, nets that were opened only to allow authorized vessels to pass through, meaning that the X-craft would have to find gaps, squeeze through tiers in the steel mesh, or simply force their way past, scraping along the bottom where the nets didn't quite reach, stirring up silt and praying that their hull didn't snag on the heavy cables that could hold them underwater until their air ran out and their crew suffocated in the darkness. X7 went in first, with Place at the periscope calling out observations to his crew, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Aitken on the controls, engine room artificer William Whitley on the diesels, and diver Bob Whittam, ready to exit the submarine if they needed to manually cut through nets, the 4 men working in practiced silence as their submarine crept forward at barely 2 knots, slow enough that Place could maintain depth control, but fast enough that they could maintain steerage, threading through the outer defenses as German sailors aboard the Tirpitz went about their morning routines, completely unaware that death was approaching from below, carried in a vessel so small that even if they'd spotted it on their hydrophones, they might have dismissed it as a large fish or equipment malfunction. The first net stopped them completely, the heavy steel mesh catching on X7's bow and holding fast, forcing Place to reverse engines and try a different angle, then another. While precious minutes ticked away and the crew breathed increasingly stale air, the carbon dioxide scrubbers working overtime to keep the atmosphere barely breathable, until finally Whitley suggested they try diving deeper and scraping beneath the net, a dangerous maneuver that brought them within feet of the rocky bottom, where one wrong move could puncture their hull or foul their propeller. But Place made the call, tilted the diving planes down, and felt the submarine shudder as it squeezed beneath the net like a snake slithering under a fence. Emerging on the other side, with hull integrity intact and the crew breathing sighs of relief that fogged their tiny portholes. 2 more nets remained between X7 and the Tirpitz, and Place navigated around the second one by following a supply boat through an opened gate, taking advantage of the brief window when the Germans pulled back the anti-submarine barriers to allow surface traffic, a piece of opportunistic brilliance that saved them hours of searching for gaps, bringing them into the inner harbor where the battleship loomed above them like a floating mountain, its massive hull blocking out the sun even at periscope depth, presenting a target so large that Place couldn't see both ends of it simultaneously through his optics, which meant that placement of their charges would be relatively easy since hitting something that size was nearly impossible to avoid. The challenge would be escaping afterward, when every German gun in the fjord would be searching for them, when depth charges would be raining down and patrol boats would be crisscrossing the waters with active sonar pinging out electronic death sentences to any submarine foolish enough to remain in the area. Meanwhile, X6 under Lieutenant Donald Cameron was having a rougher time, having gotten tangled in nets repeatedly, sustaining damage to her periscope that left Cameron navigating partially blind, relying on dead reckoning and brief surface glimpses to orient himself. His crew exhausted from hours of wrestling with controls in the fetid air of their cramped compartment. But they pressed on because there was no alternative, because turning back meant that Place would be attacking alone and the mission success probability dropped dramatically if only one X-craft managed to place charges. So Cameron fought his damaged submarine through the defenses, scraping and banging against nets, until X6's hull looked like it had been in a knife fight, finally breaking through into the inner harbor, where he surfaced briefly to get his bearings and found himself staring at the Tirpitz less than 200 yards away So close that he could see German sailors moving on the deck, close enough that if anyone looked over the side, they'd spot the midget submarine immediately, forcing Cameron to crash dive and pray that the brief surface exposure hadn't been noticed, though the sudden flurry of activity aboard the battleship suggested that it had. That alarm bells were ringing and crews were racing to battle stations, which meant that the window of opportunity was closing fast and they needed to place their charges immediately. Consequences be damned. Place maneuvered X-7 directly beneath the Tirpitz's keel, using his periscope to position the submarine precisely under the battleship's engine room, then gave the order to release the port charge, feeling the submarine suddenly become lighter as 2 tons of explosives detached and settled onto the rocky bottom directly beneath 40,000 tons of German steel. Then he moved forward, repositioning X-7 under the Tirpitz's forward magazine where a second massive explosion would have catastrophic effects, and released the starboard charge, both weapons now armed with timers set for 1 hour, giving the X-craft crews enough time to escape the blast radius, but not so much time that German divers could locate and defuse the charges, a calculated gamble that assumed everything would go according to plan. Which of course it didn't, because X-7's periscope had flooded during the net penetrations, and Place was now navigating completely blind, steering by compass and intuition through waters that were rapidly filling with patrol boats and depth charges as the Germans realized they were under attack. Cameron's X-6 had been spotted, forcing him to surface when his submarine became too damaged to dive. And now German sailors were firing rifles at the tiny vessel, while Cameron and his crew scrambled out of the hatches with their hands up, surrendering rather than dying in a doomed submarine. But before they were pulled from the water, Cameron had the satisfaction of knowing that his charges were in place, that even if X-6 was captured, even if he spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp, he had accomplished the mission, had delivered the weapons that would cripple the Kriegsmarine's greatest warship, assuming the timers worked, assuming the charges didn't malfunction, assuming the Germans didn't evacuate the Tirpitz in time. Too many variables to count, but nothing to be done about them now except wait for the explosions and hope that the sacrifice had been worth it. Place tried to escape, guiding X-7 through the chaos with a flooded periscope and failing systems. His submarine taking damage from near-miss depth charges that rattled the crew like dice in a cup, while above them, the Germans were going berserk, dropping charges everywhere, firing into the water at shadows and oil slicks, determined to kill whatever was attacking their precious battleship, and Place kept diving deeper, trying to get under the maelstrom, until X-7 struck something solid, probably another anti-submarine net, and became hopelessly tangled, trapped like a fly in a spider's web with batteries dying and air running out. The crew, knowing that they had perhaps 15 minutes of breathable atmosphere left and no way to free themselves, so Place made the decision to blow ballast and surface, accepting capture rather than suffocation, and X-7 broke through the waves one final time, her crew stumbling out into the cold Norwegian air and the muzzles of German rifles. Place shielding his eyes against the bright sunlight and checking his watch, seeing that they had 3 minutes until detonation, 3 minutes until years of planning, and the lives of so many brave men would be validated or rendered meaningless, depending on whether those charges actually worked. The German sailors who fished the British submariners from the water were professionals, treating their prisoners correctly, if not kindly, taking them aboard patrol boats and offering cigarettes and ersatz coffee, curious about these men who had somehow penetrated defenses that were supposed to be impregnable, asking questions in broken English about the submarines they had piloted, questions that Place and Cameron and their crews deflected with name, rank, and serial number while secretly counting down the seconds until the charges exploded, watching the German officers and sailors going about their duties completely unaware that they were standing on top of a ticking bomb, that in less than 2 minutes the entire fjord would erupt in violence that would send the pride of the Kriegsmarine to the bottom, assuming the charges detonated, assuming the timers had survived the depth charging, assuming everything worked the way it was supposed to. But even if it didn't, even if the attack failed completely, at least they had tried, had proven that the Tirpitz wasn't invulnerable, had shown that small groups of determined men in tiny submarines could strike at the heart of German naval power and survive to tell the tale. At 0812 hours, the first charge detonated, sending a massive column of water erupting beside the Tirpitz's hull. The shock wave so powerful that it lifted the 43,000-ton battleship completely out of the water, breaking the backs of men standing on deck, shattering instruments in the control rooms, and starting fires throughout the ship, followed seconds later by the second explosion that tore into the Tirpitz's engine room, destroying turbines and generators, flooding compartments, killing dozens of crew members instantly and wounding hundreds more. The combined blasts creating a seismic event that registered on hydrophones hundreds of miles away and sent tsunami-like waves racing across Kofjord, swamping small boats and washing German sailors off their feet, while aboard the Tirpitz, absolute chaos reigned as damage control parties raced through smoke-filled corridors trying to contain the flooding, trying to keep the ship from capsizing, trying to understand what had just happened and whether more attacks were coming. Their vaunted battleship transformed in seconds, from an invincible weapon into a crippled hulk that would never sail again, never threaten another convoy, never sortie into the Atlantic to hunt British shipping. The ship's captain standing on the tilting bridge and realizing with sick certainty that everything had changed, that the Allies had found a way to kill the Tirpitz, that the age of the battleship was over, and the future belonged to smaller, faster, more unconventional weapon systems operated by men willing to die to complete their missions. Place and Cameron, standing on the patrol boats with their hands bound, felt the shock waves roll through the water and saw the enormous plumes of spray reaching hundreds of feet into the air. And they allowed themselves brief smiles before German officers began shouting at them, demanding to know how many more submarines were in the fjord, how many more charges had been placed, whether this was just the opening salvo of a larger attack. Questions the British crews answered with stubborn silence because they honestly didn't know what had happened to the other X-craft. Didn't know if X-5 had made it through the defenses or if X-10 had turned back due to mechanical problems. Didn't know anything except that their own charges had detonated successfully and the Tirpitz was clearly damaged. How badly they couldn't tell from water level, but the sheer violence of the explosion suggested that the damage was significant, possibly catastrophic, and that knowledge made the prospect of spending the rest of the war in a German prison camp almost bearable, almost worth it, because they had accomplished something that entire bomber squadrons had failed to achieve, had struck a blow for Britain that would be remembered long after the war ended and everyone who participated was dead and buried. The aftermath of Operation Source revealed the true extent of the achievement. The Tirpitz had suffered massive damage to her engine rooms. Her hull was cracked in multiple places. Her propeller shafts were bent beyond repair, and she would never sail under her own power again, transforming from an active threat into a floating artillery platform that could only be used for coastal defense. And even that limited role would end months later, when RAF Lancaster bombers, finally able to attack without worrying about the battleship maneuvering to evade their bombs, would finish what the X-craft crews started, sending the Tirpitz to the bottom with the loss of over 1,000 German lives. But it was those tiny submarines, those toys, that the Kriegsmarine had laughed at, that delivered the crucial first blow, that proved the concept and made the final victory possible. And the men who piloted them paid a heavy price for their courage, with X-5 lost with all hands, X-9 lost during the transit, X-10 forced to abort due to mechanical failures, and the survivors of X-6 and X-7 spending the remainder of the war in German captivity. Though both Place and Cameron would receive the Victoria Cross for their actions, Britain's highest award for valor, presented by King George VI himself, in a ceremony that emphasized not just their individual bravery, but the innovative thinking and operational daring that had characterized the entire mission, proving that in modern warfare, success often belongs not to those with the biggest weapons, but to those willing to think unconventionally and take calculated risks that conventional military wisdom would consider insane. The legacy of the X-craft extended far beyond the sinking of the Tirpitz, influencing submarine design and special operations doctrine for generations, demonstrating that small, specialized craft, operated by highly trained crews, could achieve strategic objectives that larger, more conventional forces could not. A lesson that would be applied in conflicts from Korea to the Falklands to the Persian Gulf, wherever naval forces needed to strike with precision and stealth against heavily defended targets. And though the X-craft themselves would be decommissioned after the war, Their spirit lived on in the SEAL delivery vehicles and mini-submarines that modern navies use for covert operations. All of them descendants of those tiny vessels that proved decisively that courage and innovation can overcome any defense, that determination can defeat superior firepower, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapons come in the smallest packages, operated by men who understand that some missions are worth dying for, some objectives are worth any sacrifice. And some stories deserve to be remembered not because they ended happily, but because they revealed something essential about human nature, about the capacity of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when everything is on the line. And failure means not just personal death, but the potential defeat of everything they hold dear. And in the end, that's what the X-Craft crews represented. Not superhuman warriors or reckless daredevils, but ordinary British sailors who looked at an impossible mission, calculated the odds, accepted that they would probably die, and climbed into their tiny submarines anyway because someone had to do it, because the Tirpitz had to be stopped, and because they refused to let fear dictate the limits of what was possible, proving once and for all that the Germans had been wrong to laugh at those toy submarines, that size doesn't determine effectiveness, that the brave are never truly
outnumbered, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal isn't the biggest gun or the heaviest armor, but the unconquerable spirit of men and women who refuse to quit no matter how impossible the odds, who persist when others surrender, who find ways to succeed when failure seems inevitable, and who remind us all that history is shaped not by nations or weapon systems but by individuals who choose to act when action seems futile, who dare when others despair, and who prove, through their sacrifice, that hope is never foolish, courage is never wasted, and victory is always possible if enough people are willing to pay the price. A price that Place, Cameron, and all the X-Craft crews paid willingly, knowingly, and without regret, their names now inscribed in the pantheon of naval heroes who proved that sometimes the smallest vessels can change the course of the largest wars, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the toy submarine wins.